2, 1.
It is the first design and art community that will lead the change for the next epoch as we find ourselves at the intersection of technology, art, science, sustainability, and design. It covers all forms of digital design and art, from fashion design to virtual reality to biodesign. It consists of serious high-power users in commercial or high-end hobby space. Each member of the community can follow each other and collaborate and find a common ground. And integral to it is a discussion forum, Forum Days. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the Forum Days, the most happening weekday seminars for the creative community. Master speakers from across the world share insights on the cutting edge of design and technology. There's a brief technology interlude, fireside chat, followed by free-flowing discussion and conversations. The idea is to generate collaborative knowledge and projects that span multiple disciplines catalyzed by this new thinking and knowledge. Forum Days bring you the precious content from across the world of fashion, photography, sound, film, design, and art. Here is an opportunity to learn, interact, share, and also discover. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our first master speaker in a series of seminars that we kick off today, Dr. Thomas E. Mical, Dean of Jindal School of Art and Architecture. Let me pause here and introduce him, as he studied at Harvard and taught 50 design studios and has been a tenured professor in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. He has been teaching and researching globally on modern theories of architecture and urbanism over his long career. His topic for the day is multiple intelligences, multiple ecologies. He is talking about new forms of thinking that is required for imagining improvements in the world. Every day, everyone is capable of multiple forms of thinking, multiple intelligences, and the design fields cultivate these new forms of thinking. From design thinking to architectural intelligence, there is a great range of ways to liberate the imagination. In this talk, we will learn about design ecologies, design futures, and how the skill to think of multiple empowers designers to liberate new world. Find food for your soul, benefit from it, and help discover money on the table. With this, I request Kunal, our host, kindly run the introduction, AV.
Right away.
So there was a brief intro to Professor Mical. Now I hand over the mic to the master speaker of the day.
Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And I'd like to use this time to talk about some ways of perhaps reappropriating your ideas about intelligence and about the world, because I think everyone has multiple intelligences, and we're in a situation right now where we need the more we can get to benefit the future growth of society, and also to imagine a world that's much better than one we have. I'm going to try to show some images to give a little bit more context to this. Hopefully, if you indulge me as I try to do a screen share. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. And what I want to talk about with the images, obviously, is the possibility of understanding this idea of the multiple and how that benefits us in a variety of ways. This is a diagram quickly just to show the array of different types of subdisciplines within the design field, the different design professions that have emerged out of time, out of necessity. And you can see what is significant is the overlap. There's not just a clear siloing of different disciplines. My home discipline of architecture, for example, as you can see, overlaps industrial design all the way down to communication design, even computer science. So this interconnectivity, or the ability for designers to work like a type of a glue connecting different types of knowledge, is actually a very important part of understanding how the mind thinks, how the future professions can operate in society. And obviously, when we're dealing with wicked problems, we need to have multidisciplinary expertise and intelligence as well. I've done a lot of teaching, mostly as an academic, studying and teaching generations of designers and people who have led different companies, including some architects who have gone on to become filmmakers and politicians as well, too. So you want to keep in mind that a lot of design projects start off not as problem solving, but as problem finding. And to do that, you want to do something maybe closer to formulating a hypothesis, taking a quick scan of the world and try to identify what, the drivers, the constants and variables might be before you even start to attempt to figure out how to solve a particular problem. Design is driven by innovation, obviously, and here you can see an example of a fundamental challenge. How do you teach fashion without using scissors? And obviously you would start to experiment, and this is a show from the Met, highlighting some 3D printed forms of high fashion, showing one of the simple technological innovations that's transformed that and other industries, including my own discipline of architecture. Architectural intelligence, as a discipline I call it, speaks about the different ways that elements can be combined and brought together in a variety of different new configurations. It's not simply taking things apart or understanding the logic of their construction or the supply chains that produce things, but finding ways to tweak, modify, adjust, or creatively misinterpret those to come up with new and more wonderful solutions. The knowledge base that you use in design, as well as art and other creative fields, can often seem to an outsider to be subjective or even chaotic. I prefer the term carnivalesque, that there's always that element of excitement, the chance juxtaposition, the epiphany moment in the shower. All of these are fundamental parts of living in the world and imagining a better future in the same way that discipline and hard work and perseverance are too. And we want to keep ourselves open to both aspects. Creative intelligences are a very important part of solving most wicked problems. And even if you know the history of science and the discovery of the benzene ring, which came to the scientist in a dream, it's very, very important to keep yourself open to chance and to keep yourself open to possibilities and to be opportunistic, even in your most critical or creative moments. One type of intelligence that's often very closely allied to design and architectural intelligence is musical intelligence. They draw upon similar areas of the brain. And one aspect of musical intelligence I've always been fascinated with is that relationship between at least two different forms of genius. Here we're looking at Miles Davis and Coltrane. Often they would perform together and operated with entirely different models of how to compose, structure, and perform music. But they found ways to collaborate, and they both advanced their discipline significantly through their reciprocity. And this is actually one of the secrets too. Designers can't really work by themselves. They have to work in relationship to something or to someone to gain any traction in the design thinking and problem solving process. Gardner in the 1980s came up with the theory of multiple intelligences. Some people have been critical of it, but it's quite important to understand that it speaks about a variety of different ways of understanding how you as an individual and your cognitive systems, your wetware embedded in your brain, allow you to not just move and navigate, but gives you the tools to interpret things that come to you, and also influences even things down to how you imagine the future and how you interpret the different things that could possibly occur in your dreams and experiences. The idea of multiple intelligences points to the possibility or the capacity within everyone to think in multiple ways, but also to learn in multiple ways too. So you can see, for example, linguistic intelligence or mathematical intelligence, posited perhaps as two very important parts of contemporary higher education, miss out on the musical, the spatial, and many of the others as well. And there's a possibility now in contemporary high-tech society for other forms of intelligence to also be emerging. If we contrast this as a theoretical proposition with the theoretical writings of the psychoanalyst and activist Felix Guattari, he posited not only do we live in a world of environment, but this environment actually is duplicated at multiple scales. He comes up with the idea in the 1970s and 80s that we actually live in multiple ecologies simultaneously. The first one is a mental ecology. He proposes that we actually have something like an ecology. You can think of it like a secret garden inside your head where things get planted, cultivated, trimmed, and there's even weeds in your thinking process. So the idea is an analogy, but it points to the possibility that the ecology of mind has to do with new structures of thinking, where things often become intergrown, entangled, and in many ways transform over time and respond to different movements as well. Simultaneous with this, whatever movements are happening within your mental capacity, especially if you're designing or scanning the world for creative opportunities like we do, there's a social ecology. Every thought has a social relationship. The things that you're thinking or concentrating on, as we know in management, whatever you focus on grows, they used to tell me. But whatever you're thinking inside often has a mirroring effect to the social relationships around you and vice versa. So you're also existing in a social ecology. Humans are social creatures. Architecture is the most social of all the arts. And so these social consequences of your innermost thoughts or your most creative ambitions have a very strong reciprocating mechanism. And the third component, the third concentric circle, is the environmental, the actual outside natural world, we used to call it. And if we stop thinking of nature as an abstraction or as a source to be in some ways commodified or exploited and think of it in terms of ecology, the term ecology is being used here deliberately to talk about dynamic systems or systems thinking where different elements and components act and interact with each other as dynamic processes at different scales. We can think of the Amazon rainforest, for example, which is a series of horizontally stratified or vertically stratified different ecosystems, that what exists at one level in the trees cannot exist at a different level too. And the same thing might be happening in the way that this structure of multiple ecologies works. So these two theoretical propositions, which sound very academic, basically say that we have multiple ways to understand and multiple forms of intelligence within us that we can learn, because you can learn music and you can learn math and you can learn design, to interpret and to transform the world. And those give you superpowers to bend reality. This theory of multiple ecology says that what we do in the world has multiple effects at multiple scales over multiple times. So even something simple as recycling or cooking your own meal has a social consequence and environmental consequence. And you can see this, for example, in the literal sense in triple bottom line accounting, which is developed in response to this model. Now, designers have always turned towards nature historically, going back to before Da Vinci, for examples of possible solutions. And nature provides a rich variety of different ways of understanding and being in the world. And here you can see, for example, a deep sea jellyfish, no need for eyes in the darkest part of the ocean. Actually a construction, an assemblage you might call this jellyfish, composed of other organisms. They are working in a holistic way, in a symbiotic way, to propel, to reproduce, and to move through the ocean environment. Design always often imagines the world in terms of ecologies, because designing ecologies is a much more future-oriented way of designing things than, say, making a building feel like a forest. And here we look at the dynamic systems, how things change and transform, the natural life cycles, and also the relationships between the parts in terms of their inputs and outcomes. When I was a young architecture professor, I was asked to reimagine a new way when I was working in London to think about teaching architecture. And this is one of the projects I came up with. Bosh's Garden of Earthly Delights is a very well-known medieval fantasy painting showing how humans would behave in a world without any corruption, sin, or vice. And it's a fantasy, but it also speaks a little bit about the human imagination. So this 600-year-old painting that you see at the top is also a bit of an example of what the future might look like if we were to follow the ideas of a delight, which goes back to the Vitruvian examples, but the idea of delight as a component of human spirit and living in nature. In this curriculum, we thought, what if the world is actually conceived of by analogy as multiple ecologies, design ecologies, media ecologies, built ecologies, even urban ecologies. Those are terms that have gained quite a bit of traction in the last decade as subdisciplines or disciplinary practices oriented towards this idea of the holistic interconnectivity of things. And we can see this a Bosh-like example, but this is just what lives in one drop of water, the various creatures, the plants, the different organisms and relationships that exist in this world, and how they, in many ways, talk about the social, the ecological, maybe not the mental, as sources of inspiration. We can see this atomistic, or perhaps this integrative model of the different pieces of the world floating around, and the world can exist in a drop of water or in the entire universe too. And at these different scales, the rules of operation are quite different. And these are things designers are often sensitive to. When I was a professor in New Zealand working with the design school, I was often reminded of the embedded and practical wisdom of the Maori Polynesian culture and their deep respect for nature and the oceanic ecologies that drove everything from their cosmology to their simple and probably most sacred of crafts having to do with weaving. And one of the challenges for designers was to incorporate these fundamental cosmic and physical forces and principles into design prospects. And for example, the Maori don't use right angles in their representation, so all of the historic representations that have deep layers of meaning in them can become quite transformational in understanding how the world and the universe works and how landscapes can uncoil and coil around things and entangle. I've also promised to talk a little about world building, because as a designer, architects are often trained to design everything from teacups to cities, and we often think about the interconnection of things. When we design a building, we could have it perform well from the property line inward, but a great designer will think about how the property line outward is impacted by the design too. And this is the way that we often can start to scale up ideas and create like acupunctural approaches, solving a problem in one place by applying pressure in a different strategic place too. This leads to the idea of world building, working with discrete moments, fragments, dreams, ambitions, remembered images, childhood memories, and trying to find places to situate them or to plant them, perhaps by analogy, into the natural environment so they can start to grow and interact in a sense of terraform. And I'm also showing this example here. This is a literal example of terraforming. Charles Darwin did a secret project for the Royal Navy on Ascension Island of grafting different plant samples from different parts of the world on this abandoned island. And most of the plants died, but at the top level, where only moisture source came from passing rain clouds, a new type of ecology emerged. It's one of the first examples of a scientific experiment to grow an ecology, hypothetical hybrid, or even artificial ecology on the Earth's surface. I'm a proponent of something called pataphysics, which is neither metaphysics nor physics or science, but the science of imaginary solutions, where you look at everything that happens in the world, not as an accident, but even mutations can teach us about the secret codes of things and ways to advance and to transform the world. We can move and adapt to new environments, for example, hermit crab and glass, and we can also develop our senses to become super senses. And these are all just, dreams that might have existed in science fiction films, but are increasingly becoming reality. The science fiction films have historically been a great source for imagining world building and alternative futures. And I think the last provocation I'm going to throw out, this is Beasley's Halozoic Grounds, and he does these installations that appear to be forests constructed almost entirely out of equipment from the medical industry, and to think about transposing ideas from one discipline or one environment to the other. This is another type of mutation, and creativity often has prospects like that. Good designers can often imagine things from different places and transpose them. You can think of the different attributes a material would have and remove them from those materials and put them on a different material and come up with a new innovation or new creation from that way. It might be helpful for us to think, and this is my closing slide, of the idea of the world being composed of not just multiple intelligences and multiple ecologies, that these somehow form other types of gardens. And in gardens, things grow over time and things will surprise you. And gardens are one of the greatest sources historically of refuge from the turmoil of the world and from politics and other things as well. So I think there's something to be said for thinking through analogies. And I believe that there is a possibility for people to develop multiple forms of intelligence, and also to apply those to even the most common problems they face, even maybe the organization of their own workspace under a lockdown, as an opportunity to think about it in terms of an ecology, but also the prospect that thinking in terms of ecologies frees you up with a new type of creativity and a new type of openness to the world that might be different than if you pursued it simply through questions of real estate or value or the mathematics of object placement. And I'm going to finish the presentation at that point. And I've been told by my colleagues that I almost talk as fast as people here in India. And I hope that wasn't too fast for everyone, but this is the range of areas that I've been working with, teaching in design schools and teaching students now for over 30 years in different countries. My closing comment to people would be to basically follow this logic of stay open to possibilities, look for those hidden connections. If something reminds you of something else, there's probably a reason for it. And there's always something creative you can do in any situation to make things better. And with that, I think I will wrap up my presentation, and then we can move on to the next part of the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. It was quite interesting because, in the world of creativity, the ideas are the very first thing from which, emanate all kind of architecture, all kind of design. And in fact, this is something which is what our next speaker, Mr. Wilton Suresh Pangoria, he's the category manager, looking at quite a wide portfolio though for him, from mobile workstations to virtual reality, from data science to strategic growth initiatives, looking at a whole gamut of creativity, working with HP for almost 7 years now and having a stint with IBM and Samsung earlier. He is, in fact, has been a multifarious role, so to say, in terms of, when he was at Samsung, perhaps he was looking at channel and sales, but, being a technologist, which is what we call techie at heart, but more of an evangelist, which is what, the role that he finds himself in, on how to leverage technology to help increase output, convert creative ideas into reality and translate them better with the help of digital tools. So he looks at the challenges as much as solutions like anybody else, but with a difference, by bringing in a layer of technology. So with this, over to you, Wilton.
Thanks, Gurshan. So, it's rightly said, because, the era what we are in, changes are happening every day in and day out. We are living in an era where change is the only constant. So when I talk to a fraternity at technical fraternity, or when I talk to creative fraternity, architects, designers, sketch artists, videographers, or radio jockeys, the biggest thing they have got a very creative brain, or they get very creative ideas. But the biggest challenge what they face in terms of technology is how to articulate that and how to take to the customer. So live examples are like, for example, if you have got architects or interior designer who have designed my house, the language they use is in inches and mm, and typically any housewife or any guy who is not from a technical background, he may require a Google to convert inches to mm. It's a very practical problem. Now the similar thing can be converted into a VR. Any AutoCAD files, 3D files, or any Revit or Maya files can be converted into a VR, and VR is so immersive that it does not require any technical expertise for an end customer, and the number of iterations or errors get reduced drastically. Similarly, if your workflows, when we talk from a creative perspective, if your workflows requires a lot of colors, so people are right now working on Full HD or maximum on 4K, but there is something which is called as dream color, reproduction of 2 billion colors simultaneously on a screen. So typically in a workflow of a photography, you have to do color calibration multiple number of times, and that is where, the Apple plays a major important role. But there are alternate technologies which are available. So for example, a photographer, when he shots photography of a wedding couple, red becomes magenta, magenta becomes something else, and different shades of red. And final when he takes out a printout, it's a different shade which neither a photographer wants nor the end customer wants. So color correction, if you have what color calibrations which is required, so go for a technology which suits to your workflows. So biggest understanding of the technology definitely it's something which is an addendum to the art, and art cannot go, and in this era art cannot go alone without a technology. So people have to adapt the technology. And the guys who are right now on the top of, in their respective field, whether it is a creative or architect, definitely has adopted technology a long back, and they are the early adopters of the technology. So that is what my summation is. Though we are creators, we have got very imaginative mind, but at the same time, we also have to look for another aspect of technology, because technology is the thing which can actually convert your imagination into practicality and can take you to the places. So no one has thought from a perspective that in a COVID era, we are sharing the images, we are sharing the thought process in this fashion. But this is the reality today, right? Maybe after COVID, new normals will change, and definitely, everyone has to look for a different alternatives of taking their creativity to a different places. So that's what my summary is.
Well, that was quite interesting, because, moving together in the world of creative, obviously there is nothing individually that can be achieved if we do not take a bit of technology in our life. Like the way there was a famous ad that by Steel Authority of India, talking about everything else, but we say we also make steel. So this is precisely, the technology has become such an innate and inner part of our life that nothing can move alone. So we have to have digital tools in order to make our ideas being translated better, being understood better, and also at the same time be seen better by everyone. So it's both, as well as the user community as well as the provider, equally important. So in fact, we also got experts today on the panel. The people coming from professional fields, having a creative bent of mind, and have done and achieved a whole lot of stuff in their life. Let me first of all invite Ms. Zora Chatterjee. She's former Secretary Textiles, Government of India, and is an arts enthusiast. It's quite a rare combination to see in somebody coming from the IAS fraternity. She was behind the creation of UP Institute of Design in Lucknow, of which she was also the chairperson. She, in addition, also associated herself with the industries, handlooms, and handicraft sector of UP in various capacities over a decade. This is something which is very close. Art is something which is very close to her heart. So, Zoraji, I would like you to kindly reflect on this. And in fact, in case you have a question or two from Professor Mical or Wilton, over to you.
Thank you, Gursharan. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I must congratulate Scotch for once again selecting a topic which is so relevant in the present and as well as very futuristic. So it was very interesting to listen to the speakers, especially Professor Thomas Mical. And I would love to put two questions to him. One is that, take the textile sector, for example. It is a perfect example, I think, according to what I've understood from your talk, of multiple intelligences and multiple ecologies. Take, for example, a product of chicken work. Now, there is a whole chain of processes involved in it and a lot of, technical know-how. There is, starting from the dyers, if you were to take a boat ride down the Gomti, you would see on the ghats a whole string of colorful garments. It's really a sight to please the heart. This is a set of people with the expertise in dyeing and washing and creating the basic fabric. Then if you go to the streets of chalk and the bylanes, you will find a clattering little sound of wood blocks being used to print on the fabric, to print the designs of the fabric. And of course, there are a whole lot of people who are creators of design and who are specialists in making those blocks. And lastly come the embroiderers. And all of these systems, the chicken was one example, but even in other aspects of the textile sector, there is an environmental aspect involved in effluents, in dyes, chemicals. So how does one address this, Professor? And how do you do a process design across intelligences and technologies to be green and ecologically friendly? And is particularly with respect to the MSME sector. One may say the bigger industries, textile companies and all of those have got an element of design and are working these things out well. But what about the small scale sector? How do they address this issue?
It's a fascinating question. And from working with some colleagues recently at NIFT, we've talked a lot about the changes that have happened in everything from supply chains to new approaches towards manufacturing and distribution. And I think India is one of the few countries, as far as I know, that still has a viable hand-based textile industry. When I was in New Zealand, the textile industry had collapsed. And so the fundamental challenge for that discipline was, how do we transfer our knowledge of textiles in the context of New Zealand to an environment where our textiles are not internationally competitive? And so their solution was to realize that textile design was more heavily consumed in aerospace and architecture and interiors than it was in clothing. And as a consequence, started to migrate closer towards product design, smart textiles, wearables, and those high-tech fields. So one solution was a drift of knowledge or embodied wisdom and expertise into the high-tech sector. The other alternative, which I've noticed here and came up quite often in discussions with the students, was the finding other applications for those different aspects of, as you pointed out, everything from the people who craft blocks out of wood that are used for the printing, to finding out new ways to use the transportation system so that no vehicle shifting fabrics from one place to another is empty on either side of the trip. And I think there's been so many interesting and fascinating experiments. I've even seen student presentations recently about using bacteria and mushrooms as the basis for producing fabric, as well as 3D printing. So even the material basis for textiles is something that's slightly being expanded. I'm going to argue that over time, cleverness, creativity, and innovation will overtake the status quo. And that people will find new and better uses for some of the things that they're doing, but that embodied knowledge that goes back 3, 4, 6 generations is actually just as valuable, and probably incredibly more so in a time when there's great uncertainty and great risk. Having multiple intelligences or being aware of those, and there's many of our students are very good at music or mathematics or both, but maybe not as kinesthetics, whereas a lot of the industries you just described are very bodily, and the craftsmanship is very bodily based too. So there's probably natural knowledge systems embedded in those too. The fundamental challenge of how to make industries green, we know that the 2 biggest industries in terms of pollution generation are my home discipline of architecture, and then fashion is the second most. So those 2 industries have probably put the most effort into trying to find solutions to what is unsustainable practices. And often it doesn't turn on industry, it turns on lifestyle and even questions of ethics. So sometimes the solution to some of the technical problems is not in a new technology, but it's in teaching in the next generation what is a better way to do things. So I'm optimistic that over time, all of those things will work together in maybe not a coordinated way, but in a more helpful way, so that there are affordable components and dyes that are sustainable, and they will price the unsustainable ones out of the market, and people will become accustomed, as I did when I went to Canada and saw that rubbish bins were actually color-coded into 4 different types, and you pre-sorted things, and they would label the ones that were waste, they would label it landfill to discourage people from putting waste in there too. So I think that those areas are happening across a great many industries. The fascination I have with textiles in particular is the fact that the process of making and the industrial manufacture of it, even if it's local and handmade, same with architecture. You can build your own house and you can make your own clothing, but there's also this idea of scalability built in. And there's also within both of those, there's memory and there's tradition. And some of those memories and traditions contain elements that might need to be modified if they want to be purely sustainable, but also they might serve important cultural or other functions too.
So Professor Mical, in fact, there are quite a few questions which probably relate to what you're saying. So I think let me, flag these so that they also feel happy that their questions have been answered. So I think there is one which is a technology question. I think Wilton, you would be in a better position to answer this.
Yes.
Shashi Sharma is asking, what tool is best for Sketch, and what configuration laptop do I need?
So typically, Sketch, you need something which is touch enabled, so at least something which talks about a lot of colors, which is touch enabled, and something which supports your sketching practice. So I mean, though I don't want to name, in this forum about the speeds and feeds and the product what we sell, you can probably search on Google something which is called as X2 or X360 that is supported for SketchUp artists, and that is what is available. So there are a lot of other devices available from different vendors, right? But first you need to define your workflow, what workflow and what colors you want to know, and how much you deal with colors. Based on that, there are multiple products which are available, and different price range, of course, are available. So having said that, something which supports your workflow in terms of color, so something, I can definitely name from my product line. There is something which is called X360, and with Dream Color enabled, that's the product we should go, and minimum 16 GB and Core i7 processor.
Great. Shneel Malik is asking Professor Mical, absolutely fascinating. So, there is a word of appreciation that comes from another specialist. And how do you see the interdisciplinary boundaries changing? And what collaborations do you reckon are key to the next phase of innovations in designing ecologies?
Okay. Interdisciplinarity is increasingly becoming necessary, and even students are recognizing that. Law students want to study everything, including law, and designers want to study other things too. But also in problem solving. I'll give two examples recently from New Zealand, which is a very tiny country and is very geared towards ecology. That one of the biggest industries for hiring students in product and service design was actually Air New Zealand, because they wanted everything from the menus to the smells on the airplane to the luggage carousels to be designed so they're a positive experience for the user. So the idea of a comprehensive design environment and every aspect of it is something that moves across disciplinary boundaries and would involve engineering, finance, human factors, psychologists, and even social work gets involved in some of the designs too. We always tell students, and when I was working in many countries, design thinking was so popular, we had more non-designers taking it than designers. And design thinking basically teaches you other approaches as a shortcut of how to come up with new and innovative solutions. For design ecologies, you'll see that I think the next couple presenters in this series are going to be talking very specifically about postdoctoral research work in labs. And the designers I work with come up with hypothetical designs for everything from healthcare to new ways of distributing information on websites and UX, UI design too. So my argument is that if we think in terms of systems and ecologies and use open-ended, process-oriented models, instead of thinking of designing products, but we think of designing services, or if the products are considered to have lifespans to them, if we think in terms of processes, then we actually have a lot of freedom. And it says also that people are processes. It means we're all works in progress too, that we don't reach a point of finality or conclusion, and the same thing with the things we design. So ecological thinking as a metaphor has long permeated design schools, but now the shared vocabulary that's being forced on us, often by these crises, are creating more opportunities for interdisciplinarity as well. Right? A year ago, it'd be very hard to find people who wanted to work on healthcare design for the environment. But after the lockdown, everybody wants to, say something about it too. So if we don't take charge of it, someone else will. So I think it's very important for us.
I think this is encouraging Shneel to ask another question. But at this moment, let me bring in Professor Shalin Sharma, who is Dean at the School of Architecture, World University of Design. He's an alumnus of De Montfort University, UK, and has been a practicing architect for over 22 years, and academically involved on a visiting basis with the reputed institutions like University School of Architecture, Planning, and so on. So a quick reaction from Professor Shalin.
Hi, Thomas. It was very interesting to hear you. I don't have any question, but I just want to add on to what you had said. In India, while we design, ultimately we are basically creating a product, but which requires a procedure. Of course, both are interconnected, that if you want to produce. But what about the soul of that product? I was very impressed by that slide of yours of the Maori tribe that you had shown. So whereas we can endlessly discuss the anatomy of a product, but what about the soul of it? I think most of the people actually missed that out. And during this time period, I think that is something that we should actually concentrate on. It is not a question. I'm just adding on to what you had said. And if you want to add on, because you have gone through that process, so I would love to hear something about the soul of the Maori tribe. Actually, that's all.
Okay. Well, I can talk a little bit about it.
Professor Mical, let me also get one more question which you can combine and possibly have a quick reply to whatever Shalin just talked about. Rohan is Director Public Policy at Scotch Group. He would like to ask a question. Rohan, can you go ahead, please?
Fantastic talk, Dr. Mical. I loved the idea of interdisciplinarity that you brought in the Q&A session. It was heartening to see you share Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences and Kothari's idea of multiple ecologies. But what perhaps struck me most was the idea of pataphysics, and what you left us with a thought, look for hidden connections from memory, and one thing that's similar to another. And I have one such interdisciplinary question for you. In your discipline, you look towards the environment, you look towards natural resources, and you look towards finding solutions for human interactions with space. My question from an economics discipline would be, well, many years ago at the Planning Commission of India, there was this proposal to attach a shadow value to natural resources in the hope of attaching a value to these natural resources, which could then be calculated under the national accounts framework. So just the idea that if you look at ecologies and if you look at a village and you look at a river in that village, or you look at a forest area in that village, how would you in your discipline, while thinking of design ideas, seek to attach a value to that natural resource, and what would this value be?
Let me superimpose one more question, which has come from one of the attendees. I mean, there's so much of excitement all around. I just can't stop myself as well. There's this lady called Aisha Goel. She's asking, is it possible to combine the intelligences given by Gardner to create something innovative, which exactly what Rohan is also talking about. So you have a minute to answer.
All right, I think I can do this. The first question was about the idea of spirit and the idea that even in New Zealand, the trees are considered sentient beings by law and protected to some degree as well. And so this pantheism, or this understanding of what's sometimes called type of Gaia theory, has to do with the interconnectedness of things, that nothing can be done in isolation and everything has consequences down the road. And in the case of the Maoris, it's a very clearly defined, well-defined. It's embedded in the linguistics, it's embedded in the representational systems, it's embedded in the landscapes. But there's plenty of examples in India of indigenous knowledge too that are just as powerful and perhaps just as articulate, but maybe invisible to people. So I would throw that back too and say there's plenty of good examples in India as well as New Zealand. The second question is actually very profound in that it asks what's the difference between value and cost? Because we live in a society where people will do a calculation and figure out the cost of things. And when I discovered triple bottom line accounting, there's actually another one that's got 4 axes where you calculate the financial, the social, the environmental, as well as the spiritual consequences of different decisions. And I've been told that many things that make sense financially can be very detrimental to the environment and society. So even something banal like saying, should we put up a parking garage and tear down the forest? Financially, it might make sense in the short term, but if you actually take a broader view, the value embedded in those other things, that shadow value as we talked about, is something that you perceive and would value in a high way. The same way children or other people would perhaps see something special, magical about the environment they live in. The idea of combining multiple intelligences, if I understand Gardner correctly, Gardner says we have the capacity for all of those. So many of my colleagues here in India speak 3, 4, 5 languages, whereas Americans, we're lucky if we can learn one. And as a consequence of that, even having multiple languages gives you different types of ways of understanding and interpreting the world. So you can imagine it as being a type of literacy at multiple levels. Some people have great bodily poise and balance, and some people have very good understanding of mathematics, and those are capacities that everyone has, and there definitely are combined. And I know I have a colleague in Lebanon who's a good engineer and a great photographer, although he thinks the opposite is the case. And he uses very different types of his intelligence to do both work, and I imagine that one leaks into the other anyway. So the idea is that you can always develop and cultivate these things. Design can be taught, mathematics can be taught, economics can be taught, even Maori cosmology or indigenous knowledge systems here can be taught because they have been taught. And I think it's in the teaching actually that the value is produced. And so if you know something incredibly important, even if it is something that is local to one community, there's a knowledge system embedded in that that is of great value. And by value, I don't mean cost or economic prosperity. By value, I mean something that can create more substance and substantiate the human spirit as one of the things we design. Because it's very nice to design something that works, but it's much more important to have something around your house or your work environment. For example, if you look at all my colleagues and their art collections, we know intrinsically that that's just as valuable as a financial bottom line. Being surrounded by beautiful things and being surrounded by healthy environments is crucial for maintaining the human spirit. And so I think that's where I see a convergence between all of these questions.
Very nice. Thank you so much. And I have one technology question to Wilton from Vivek Joshi. Can designers be indulged into technology up to the degree as authentic developers are?
Of course, yes. If you see, even just to give an example, Infosys sometime back used to hire only engineers, and that too again computer engineers. But when it comes from gaming perspective, or from architectural perspective, or from designing perspective, or VR, you don't have to be engineer, you just have to be an artistic, and your artistic bent of mind, right? And you just know couple of tools which are like application tools, you just stitch and convert it into VR. So not necessarily that the shift is happening. You don't have to be for technical bent of mind. You have to, just to have to have a liking for any creativity. If that is there, right, there are tools available which can be converted into beautiful end products, whether using through 3D printers or VR.
There is one last question for Professor Mical. It's coming from Mani Singh. Talking about architecture, I believe buildings have their own spirit, which is put there by all the brainstorming of an experienced architect, considering culture of the context and the sentiments of people living there. Will technology be able to do that ever?
There's a couple of interesting biases in that question, and it's something that was affirmed in my education too. The ancient Greeks, we were told, in Western civilization, believed in something called the genius loci, the spirit of a place. And this is something we find in a lot of phenomenological research, Christian Norbert Schurz and others, that say that the difference between a space and a place, space is mathematical and abstract and quantifiable. Place is something that has qualities and attributes and is qualitative and usually distinct. There's only one home, there's only one playground from your childhood, for example. As a consequence of that, even when architects make buildings, which is part of what architects do, we follow an auteur theory, which means, like filmmakers, we think the director does everything. But for an architect to make a building, everything from the excavation of the ground to the bringing in the utilities to the master planning of the construction equipment, there's actually a whole ensemble of people. As we heard in textiles, there's a whole network that produces the production of one building. To have everything automated, or to use machine learning or any of the most recent advances in fuzzy logic, can't get close yet. And we cannot even mathematically describe how a drop of water hitting a pond will create the exact ripples. So we make best guesstimates when there's CGI representations. But the mathematics, I'm told by my mathematician friends, is not there to describe the movement of drops of water. And as a consequence, the movements of the human mind and the experience and how you perceive your same kitchen in the morning and in the afternoon, there's still too many variables there, and they're qualitative, not quantitative. So that's the fun part. In the same way that the nutritionist can tell you the exact components of a meal, only a master chef can tell you why it tastes so delicious. And I would make that distinction as something important in architecture too.
Thank you. We also have with us Mr. Samir Kochar, Chairman, Scotch Group. So maybe a few words from your side.
Well,
Samir, you're muted. Kindly unmute yourself.
Yeah. So, thanks a lot, Michael. That was very interesting. And specifically, I love the question from Mani Singh, because I also believe that a home has a soul. And I'm quite aghast at all the ghastly architecture that I see around me, where they use from metal to wood to glass to stone to plaster, every possible material that there is to make their house look exactly like their neighbors. So there is, I think, a session that needs to be had on self-awareness and emotional intelligence. Perhaps we'll invite you again to talk about that. But what I really like about this initiative, Gulsharan, is the fact that you have technologists, architects, designers, painters, sound engineers all together. And the multidisciplinarity of all that we do is extremely important. And I find myself always technologically challenged. So I find that what Wilton has done is given an interesting perspective. And as we move forward, I hope we pick up a bit of technology from him, and he picks up a bit more jargon on architecture and design from us. And then together we can do some collaborative projects with HP, Intel, and the community. Thank you very much for joining us. Do join us on 30th. For our next session, we have Shneel Malik, who was one of the questioners today. She works on biodesign. She looks at bioorganisms and tries to build them into design and art and architecture. So it will be a very interesting session. We also have a community called digitalartsforum.com. Do explore that and join. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all very much once again, and I look forward to seeing you again. It was really, really a very engrossing, involving, and an interesting experience with you all. And It was quite a learning for myself. As Samir also said, we are challenged as far as technology is concerned. But yes, we imbibe almost on a daily basis, and this is something which is an effort. It's going to be ongoing beginning today. As I said, that it's a kickoff, and we're going to have many, many more such involving sessions in times to come. We already have overshot by 5 minutes. And as I can see in the window, there are almost 15, 20 questions waiting. I wish we had that kind of time to go through and make everyone happy. But yes, questions will always remain, but answers keep coming in as we move on. Thank you all.
Thank you.